welcome. My name is Sandy Starr. I work for a biomedical charity called the Progress Educational Trust, and I'm the producer of this year's Science and Medicine strand at the Battle of Ideas, and with typical modesty and humility, we've called it the battle over life and death. And the reason we've called it that is because when my colleagues and I were looking at the liveliest controversies and the most pressing issues in science and medicine at the moment, many of them seem to have this sort of dauntingly profound and existential character, and where better to grapple with such difficult questions than the Battle of Ideas Festival. So the strand's going to be running in this room throughout the day, and it literally covers everything from life to death. It'll begin in a few moments with what is a good life, can science and medicine tell us, and it will close at the end of the day with what is a good death, can science and medicine tell us. And between those two debates, we'll also have debates on can big data save the world, eugenics, myth and reality, and the NHS still worth defending? Question mark. I've been involved in science and medicine debates at the Battle of Ideas for more than 10 years now, and throughout that time, those science and medicine strands have benefited from the invaluable support of the Wellcome Trust. And this year's strand is no exception, and we're very grateful for their support. For now, I just want to hand over to Helen Jameson, who's head of media at the Wellcome Trust, to say a few words, and then Helen will hand over to my colleague Rob Lyons, sitting behind me, to chair this morning's debate.
Thank you, Sandy, and welcome everybody this morning. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. The Wellcome Trust are really, really proud to sponsor and support this event, and I think the strand that will happen throughout the day is going to provide some great opportunities for discussion about some truly thorny issues. The Wellcome Trust is a global charitable foundation that's dedicated to improving health, so because of that, a large amount of what we do is about funding medical research around the world, which I think fits really nicely with this strand today. We believe that improving health is not just about medical research, it's about seeing those medical and scientific advances in their broadest societal, political and ethical context. And I think that's what today is all about. So without further ado, I hope you really enjoy both this session this morning and the rest of the day, and I will pass over to our chair for the first session, Rob.
So thank you, Sandy and Helen. So welcome to this first debate in the strand. What is a good life? Can science and medicine tell us? I'm Rob Lyons. I'm Science and Technology Director at the Institute of Ideas. So in recent years, we've seen a lot of discussion about evidence-based policy and evidence-based medicine. Decisions, it seems, about almost everything need to be based on what the research tells us. And if the research tells us, for example, that a particular lifestyle choice is bad or unhealthy, then experts will say, we need to be banned or restricted in some way. Equally, there's been a considerable discussion about how much our lives are determined by our genes. Should we just accept that the way we are is determined by our inheritance, as it were, but whether it's our genes directly or epigenetic phenomena, as we'll no doubt hear about very shortly, our complex social behaviours like criminality or homosexuality actually just coded for, and therefore that kind of takes the moral questions out of the equation. Is there any room left when science and medicine gets involved for free will and moral thinking? That's just some of what we might talk about. And our first speaker, Professor Jeannette Pols. Jeannette is a Socrates Professor of Social Theory, Humanism and Materialities at the Department of Anthropology on the Programme of Healthcare and the Body at the University of Amsterdam. She is also Associate Professor and Principal Investigator at the Section of Medical Ethics at the Department of General Practice at the Academic Medical Centre in Amsterdam. Welcome, Jeannette. Next to speak, on my immediate right, is Nancy Hay. Nancy has set up the world's first What Works Centre for Wellbeing, which aims to understand what governments, business, communities and individuals can do to increase well-being. She has worked in 9 government departments on areas including constitutional reform. She says she has degrees in arguing, brackets law, and in listening, brackets coaching and development. So there you go. So hopefully she'll be up for a good argument today. Welcome, Nancy. On my immediate left is Dr. Nessa Carey. Nessa is International Director at Praxis Unico, the UK's leading organisation for technology transfer professionals, and is a visiting professor at Imperial College London. For more than a decade, she has been specialising in epigenetics, one of the fastest moving disciplines in biology. She's the author of the books The Epigenetics Revolution, How Modern Biology is Rewriting Our Understanding of Genetics, Disease and Inheritance, and Junk DNA, A Journey Through the Dark Matter of the Genome. Welcome, Nessa. Finally, on my far left, Angus Kennedy. Angus is convener of the Institute's Ideas educational initiative, The Academy, which he established in 2011 as a modest attempt to demonstrate over 4 days of reading and discussion what university should be like and is so rarely like. And I can confirm the value of that particular event, because I've been a few times myself now, and it's very, very good. He's interested in writing and interested in writes on the philosophy of freedom, and is the author of Being Cultured in Defence of Discrimination. And just a quick summary of his biography, basically he spent the rest of his life obtaining master's degrees in just about everything. So welcome to Angus. Our speakers will talk for 5 to 7 minutes each, just to get your intellectual juices flowing, as it were, and then we'll have your questions and comments and take it from there. So first up, Jeannette.
Thank you very much. So, whether we like it or not, the sciences, and particularly biomedicine I'm going to talk about, they are profoundly influencing our ideas and our lives already. So there's no question whether they should do so. They are already there. So we fly around the globe to attend these kind of festivals, or we make robots take over our work. We organize our friendships, our leisure time through social media. And we become older than ever before. And in all these developments, there are notions embedded of what is a good life, and they're not all our own, but they are certainly there. So the way that the sciences influence what we think of as a good life depends on the one hand what the sciences do to us, so how they influence our lives and how they shape our lives. And on the other hand, it's also important to look at how the sciences take into account what we think of this good life. And I want to speak briefly about both themes. So an example of the first thing, the tendency that the sciences influence our lives, is that we live longer and we live with more chronic diseases. So biomedicine is changing. Rather than curing diseases, in the sense of making them go away, biomedicine turns diseases that were formerly lethal into chronic diseases. And a great example is cardiovascular disease. There has been a dramatic decrease of heart attacks. Once the major cause of death, now heart patients are chronic patients. They have to swallow a set of medications, and they have to live with this kind of medication to lower blood pressure, to stop their blood from clotting, cholesterol medication, and so on. And people report side effects on these medications, like fatigue or dizziness, and so on. And they might feel worn out by their disease, but they're not dying from it anymore. Their disease has become chronic, and they face quite a different set of problems to cope with it. So the great drama of sudden death and heroic cure has turned into the inconveniences of the everyday, you could say. And apart from this, from diseases becoming chronic ones, we've become older and older, and this means that we have to live with these diseases for a longer period of time. And what we see happening in the Netherlands most recently is that people start to object to this longevity and inconvenienced lives. They want their lives to stop, and they ask their doctors for support. And this is probably something that's more in the surface in the Netherlands because we have some legal arrangement for euthanasia. But people increasingly take that as a right rather than as a last resort. And one group of these people, interestingly, they report that they're tired of living. And these are older people, and they lost their relatives and their family, and they are bothered by all kinds of chronic diseases that are not really unbearable diseases, but they just don't see the joy in life anymore, and they want to end their lives. So I think this is one of the most urgent questions about the good life that we need to address. So this is how we can live with these chronic diseases and with these longer lives, with the kind of treatment that involves. And this brings me to the second area where the sciences influence what is a good life. And this is how they evaluate, or how they take our evaluations of what is a good life into account or not. I think the main way in which they do that are measurements of quality of life in biomedicine. These are outcomes of clinical studies. So if you have a treatment and you want to measure the effect on, say, the reducing of the tumor, you will also measure how it impacts on quality of life. And this is an extremely influential measurement. It's almost imperative for biomedical researchers to measure quality of life. But it also influences on a policy level what kind of therapies should be financed, and also more globally with the use of QALYs and DALYs. These are ways of establishing which treatments should be financed or not. And we have these notions like the global burden of disease, where we try to assess worldwide what treatments do to lives, but also to costs, of course. So they have a tremendous impact on treatment and health policy. But if you take a closer look at these quality of life measurements, you see that it's very unclear what they actually measure. And we had a look at a couple of these questionnaires in our department, and we could already see a myriad of things that they were measuring. One was functioning, so whether a treatment would affect your functioning. A second one was mental health and depression. There were questionnaires that measured overall ratings of happiness, so give a note to your life. And that could be anything that people would think of. And maybe most shockingly, in many publications, it's not very clear what's being measured, if quality of life is being measured, because there are all kinds of different questionnaires specific for diseases, and you cannot access them, so you basically do not know what they are, and they are not described in the papers that report on them. But I think one of the problems of these quality of life measurements is that if we have the same disease, that doesn't mean that we share the same set of values. So if we treat values in the same way as physiology, like we have a kind of general response to treatment, that's kind of odd, because we might value the effects of treatment quite differently. And this is not being taken in by modern quality of life measurements. And I think, particularly when it comes to the, longer lives, more chronic disease, we need more to learn more about these values of living longer with chronic diseases, and when this is a good life, and how we can accommodate the treatments, and what would be helpful to us. And I think that we should try better as scientific researchers to bring in the stories of people and to better study them than we do now.
Okay, thank you very much. Nancy.
So the good life is a term for the life we would like to live. This is another term for happiness or our well-being. And well-being is health in its broadest sense. So when we talk about well-being, we're talking about well-being as a positive way of saying how we are doing as nations, as individuals, and as communities, and how sustainable that is for the future. So it's quality of life and prosperity. It's physical and mental health in the positive sense, and sustainable, thriving communities. And it's about creating the conditions for all of us to thrive. So well-being recognises that what makes us flourish is interconnected. It's not just objective measures of employment or GDP or income, which we often proxy for our determination of what success is. But it's also how we experience our lives. Are we feeling good? Are we functioning well? And are we able to develop to our full potential? So our well-being is explained by a whole range of factors. Some of them are more important and some of them are more predictable than others. And we're starting to measure, and picking up at what Jeannette was saying earlier about how we measure our well-being, we're now as a nation starting to measure our well-being and how we feel about our lives, both objectively in terms of how we're valuing employment or income or wealth or other things that are important to us, education, skills, but also how we feel about our lives. And this is surprisingly robust, actually. So just take a moment. The Office for National Statistics are collecting data about our subjective wellbeing. These are national statistics. And in these 4 questions, I'm going to ask you to rate how you feel about your life on a rating of 0 as not at all to 10 to completely. And there's no right or wrong, and I'm not going to ask you to shout it out. Just take 2 seconds. So the first question is, how satisfied are you about your life? The second is how worthwhile do you feel your life is? The third is how happy were you yesterday? And the last is how anxious were you yesterday? And we are asking that question nationwide and in an increasing number of studies to help judge how we are feeling and thriving as an individual nation. But here's the hitch. We're not very good at predicting what will make us happy. Money is the obvious example. So as a nation, we sort of set GDP up as the goal, as success of a nation. And an income is often used as possibly, it's money, right? That's what makes us happy. And that's part of what makes us happy. But up to a certain point, there is diminishing returns. And it helps us make us safe and secure. But after that, actually, the happiness may last of a promotion or an increase in income, but actually it doesn't last. Some things really do last. So if you're unemployed for more than a year, that has a sustained, lasting impact on your well-being. Not only do you get a dip in your well-being, it lasts. And this is important. So our collective knowledge about what makes us happy and what helps us live a good life sort of collects a whole bunch of dust as we go along. And scientific learning is a way not to fool ourselves about what we wish would make us a good life. You see these articles in the paper about a bottle of wine a night. Well, is she good for you or whatever? This may be wishful thinking. It's a way of getting high-quality feedback. I'm not joking, that's a real article. High-quality feedback on how we're doing. It's a way of learning and sharing that learning, of accumulating collective knowledge, and crucially rechecking that knowledge. We have long taken a scientific and experimental approach to looking at ill-being and why should we not apply this to what makes us flourish, to health in its fullest sense. This does not mean there's not been plenty of intellectual tyranny of the name of science and in the name of marketing, a tyranny of experts telling us what we should and shouldn't do or what this product claims to do. But a scientific approach includes the freedom of thought and the importance of doubt. We are free to judge the conclusions of what evidence is found, and that's really important when it comes to a scientific approach. Maintaining curiosity, open-mindedness and doubt is fundamental to our shared learning, as is holding on to the joy, the wonder and beauty of things as we make observations and pay attention to our world. Complicated fields still need reliance on wisdom, and our well-being and our notion of a good life is a complicated field. But that does not mean we can't observe it scientifically and, importantly, check out some of our collective wisdom, what it means to lead a good life. We're finding new ways of learning about what makes us thrive as human beings in our interconnected world keep emerging. The astonishing findings from neuroscience and genetics, for example, tell us about how meditation, kindness and social contact affect the brain and the body and how we are born genetically interact with our environment. We're starting to be able to observe the effect of positive emotions on the body and on the brain and our interactions, including the effects of what we value, including love. You start to see that you can get 3 times the amount of positive emotion is required to balance out those negative events that happen, at least, for example. We know that the midlife crisis is probably physiological. We've compared it to actually great apes also experience this. So well-being notably dips, and you're fairly high well-being until your 20s. It comes down, probably bottoming out about 48, and then goes back up and keeps going up. So at 65, you're probably really quite happy. So the Danish retired women are the happiest in the world. And it keeps going up. And actually, there's some drop-off at older age, but mostly it just keeps on going up. We get wise. Through scientific approaches, we're starting to understand how the environment gets into our body. The psychosocial model of stress, for example, reflects the role of hormones of cortisol, oxytocin, and testosterone on the body and how it interacts with our environment. Discoveries about the nervous system, including the nervous system in the gut, and how they interact and how they help us survive and heal, are helping us understand what it means to live a good life. How optimism, positive emotion, and kindness affect us. Understanding how positive social relationships impact on our physical and mental and societal well-being starts to help us understand what it is to make a good life. So we can group them together. Our collective wisdom tells us that if we give, we connect, we're active, we keep learning, and we take notice. That helps us live a good life. So if a good life is the life we would like to live, science helps us check in with our collective notion of well-being and what that means. A scientific approach is the importance of doubt, and not as a blemish on our ability to know, but as the very essence of knowing. Questioning what makes us happy, the shared interest and curiosity in what contributes to a good life is essential, therefore, to our well-being and our good life. And the first thing we can do as ourselves is look after our own well-being. We shine a great light and we cast a great shadow. So that's my call to you, is look after your own well-being.
Okay, thank you. I'm 47, so basically what you're saying is next year's going to really suck, but it gets better after that.
Yeah,
thanks.
you're on the up
Okay,
now.
cheers. Nessa.
Okay, so my well-being will be considerably enhanced by less long-haul travel and fewer colds, so I apologise for being all snuffly. I get to do the segue into the geeky stuff now and to talk about epigenetics, which is a phrase that's bandied about in a really annoying way, which means it doesn't mean anything anymore. But I'm going to give you like 5 minutes of what epigenetics is. And epigenetics is a fabulous field of science because what it's doing is freeing us from the tyranny of genetic determinism, but without moving into hippy-dippy crap, basically. So it's important that we have a functioning genetic code, that our DNA is right, okay? And for most of us, our DNA is fine. It doesn't give us a devastating disease. But our DNA is essentially just necessary for a good life. It's not necessarily sufficient because our DNA can't possibly explain everything. And if I look around this room, there's, I don't know, about 60 people in here. Every single one of us is a masterpiece of epigenetics. Because epigenetics just means stuff that's happening in addition to genetics. All the 70 trillion cells in your body have exactly the same DNA. And yet, those cells are different from each other. You don't get bits of heart coming out of your liver. You don't get teeth appearing in your eyeballs, okay? And that's because, although they all contain the same DNA script, they use that information differently. And I use the phrase DNA script quite deliberately. That's how I think of it. It's like a script. And yet, what it gets throughout our lives is additions to it, just as you would annotate any script for any play or any film. Sometimes those modifications to it could be made in biro, sometimes in pencil, sometimes on post-it notes. Just like a real script, our DNA script gets modifications on it, some of which last for a really long time, some of which can be put on and can be taken off. And those modifications control gene expression. They're what means that our liver knows to be a liver and our heart knows to be a heart. It uses the right set of genes. So they actually control gene expression, but they also provide a memory of what genes have been switched on and what genes have been switched off. And we can monitor this now. We can actually start to analyse this. So we get some idea of how our genes have been affected by the environment. Because that's what epigenetics is that link between nature and nurture. It's how the environment talks to our genes and can change gene expression for a really long time. And this can have lots of implications for, say, human disease. So lots of cancers are driven by epigenetics. There's nothing wrong with our DNA, it just starts behaving in the wrong way. It starts being used in the wrong way. In the way there's nothing wrong with a spanner if you use it to loosen a bolt, but there's quite a lot wrong with a spanner if you use it to hit somebody over the head. Okay? We're just using some of our genes in the wrong way. May also be involved in things like post-traumatic stress disorder or the adult consequences of childhood abuse. Why are adults who were abused or neglected as children so much more prone to mental health disorders as adults? What's happening in their brains that is setting them in this highly stressed state for the rest of their lives? So epigenetics has the potential to answer an awful lot of questions about what's happening to us and how we respond to it at a biological level. And I believe everything does have a biological level and a biological explanation. But where I think we need to be careful is in confusing mechanism with determinism. Just because everything has a biological basis doesn't mean that everything is deterministic, that everything can be explained by some predicted interaction between the genome and the environment and how epigenetics works in that. Partly because there's a lot of random stuff that happens. You know, we give it great names in science like stochastic variation, but what we actually mean is random crap, okay? Stuff just happens. But also because I think it's impossible to conceive of a situation where we genuinely can understand everything. Take the human body, 70 trillion cells. Each of those cells contains DNA, made of 3 billion different little building blocks all joined together. Then we have these epigenetic modifications like the post-it notes that are added to it. But there are hundreds of them, and they can work in billions of different combinations. And then you take the human brain, and you add in that complexity of all that's happened with the DNA, all that's happened with epigenetics, all the interactions of the environment, and then the extraordinary number of ways in which the billions of brain cells form connections with each other, you're basically looking at the 1.5 kilograms of the most complex material in the universe when you look at the human brain. So although epigenetics gives us good ways into this and is throwing up some interesting stuff about whether or not we are affected by what happened in previous generations, I would say although it has the capacity to inform us about a good life and to tell us about people's experiences, we should not expect that it becomes some perfect catch-all that explains everything. And I would really caution about that, because take any set of magazines, whether they're from psychology or from cosmetics or anything else, there's an awful lot of rubbish talked about this field. And before you even start waving the yellow card at me,
Yes. Well done. Thank you very much, Nessa. Angus.
Thanks. I feel I'm slightly the odd one out here because I'm not a scientist, and I'm going to talk about, I suppose, the complicated side of a good life, maybe in more the sort of moral sense of good. I think Nessa's right at the end to point out that it can be a danger for scientists to leap in to explain things that are more complicated than biological grounding may be able to account for. There may be biological basis for self-consciousness, but we certainly haven't found that yet. When we ask ourselves what we think about things, we start to move into an area of subjective self-consciousness. It doesn't seem to be an area that science can easily give us answers on. And even if there's a lot of terminology around that seeks to sort of lay claim to the idea of what a good life is, whether or not a good life is a healthy life, seems a kind of easy collapse to make in Nancy's comments within the sort of opening sentence. We move from good equals happiness equals well-being equals health. And that, that's the collapse of very long range of things that I think need to be kept apart when we look at these kind of questions. And it became quite easy to be overcome by the terminology. We can succumb to it, if you like, and say, positivity, yay, let's have more positivity in my life. Negativity, oh, But what does that mean? What does 3 times the amount of positivity in your life mean, and is that good? Or is it bad? Is love necessarily a positive emotion? I'm not sure. It's quite so simple to break it down. So I'm going to be on that end of the question, sort of what is good life in the sense of what is a morally good life. And I think when we look for what the good in life is, the first question we ask is, should we look out there, maybe in the science, in the measurements of quality of life, in the metrics, or do we look in here and ask ourselves what the good in life is? I stand on that side of the question. That I start by asking myself what is good. It's not that I hold a relativist position on it. It's not like, Angus, what's good, or whatever I feel like. I think I could be wrong about that judgment. I think there are some things that are right and some things are wrong. And most of the time we know what it is. So throwing babies off cliffs tends to be on the bad side of human activity. And we don't need too much self-reflection to work that one out. But there are more complicated decisions, obviously, to make in life where we need deeper self-questioning to work out what is good. But nonetheless, I think that where we start from that position, by asking ourselves what is good, in that process of self-examination, we bring in thoughts about what other people think is good as well. So in asking myself what is good, I might say, well, what have other people said about it in the past? And do I think that they were right or wrong? And I try to take account of their judgments in coming to my own, in a way to be disinterested in coming to that judgment. So it's a self-judgment, but with reference to judgments made by others. And I think it's that ability to imagine a wider moral universe that means it is possible for us to come to agreement on what is morally right, to have a sort of a common sense, a shared understanding of what is morally good. And it's here that I think that science is unable to help us. Measurements of quality of life have no bearing on these kind of questions, because there's nothing natural or biological about the good in the sense of what is morally right. In the tradition of philosophy, some people have taken a view that's quite similar to some contemporary thinking, scientifically influenced thinking about what is good. So the Stoics in the ancient world believed that a good life would be one that accommodated to what was given. So if you aligned your life to be in balance with the sort of cosmic world order of the natural good and found your place in the cosmos, the determined role for you, then that was good. That's sort of trying to make the best of a bad situation in which you live on the margins left to you by, living in an autocracy. Imperial power determines the way things are. What's left for me to make my life a good one? Well, it's just fitting in with the order of things, flourishing like a plant, but not doing much more. But there is another sort of more enlightened tradition in philosophical thought, from Socrates through to Christianity and Enlightenment philosophy, that thinks of the good life as being bound up with ideas of freedom. Not freedom in the sense of being able to do whatever you want, not freedom in the sense of license, but freedom in the extreme example, I suppose, of the Jesus example, to sacrifice oneself in the love of humanity. Jesus, was unemployed for years and may have been full of negative emotions, but still, I suppose, supplies something of a model of what we think a good life might be, even if it had something of a bad ending. Less dramatically, I suppose a good life is one in which we freely choose to do what we think is good. A good life is one defined by the story of one's choices, self-determining choices, the sort of choices in those difficult circumstances, not the shall I throw the baby off the cliff, but shall I move my aging mother in to live with me, or is she still all right at home? Those sort of difficult choices that may determine the shape of one's own life. To the extent that those choices are freely made, despite the constraints and limits we find around ourselves, then I think we start to move into the territory of being able to talk about whether a life has been good. Can a slave, determined being with no choices, live a good life? No, I would think. Does a free person have a good life? Maybe. Maybe yes, in the sense if a life lived freely is a good life and a life lived slavishly is not a good life. The choices that really matter here are the ones that are least bound by contingency. It's those moments in which we actually have freedom to go one way or another, and we freely choose one path through a process of reasoned self-examination, that they become our life path, and it's our life that we've lived. In that sense, we could talk about that being a good life. The final point around this that I think is difficult is that freedom in this sense is a self-interested process. A good life is a self-interested one in the sense that it's not other-determined. I decide for myself rather than letting others decide for me what the good life is. It's a series of measurements that I find inside myself rather than measure through a microscope looking from the outside. But it's also a process of self-limitation. It's often a process of saying no to things and defining oneself through duty and limitation rather than just doing whatever one feels like, which leaves a number of problems on the table, I admit. But I think maybe the area to explore, just the last thought, is that we do find this a difficult area in the contemporary world. The sort of traditional moral authority that used to give us more sort of confidence in being able to say what a good life is and what isn't has been sort of weakened. And it's in that vacuum, and science abhors a vacuum. And in this sense, it's that moral vacuum that I think in the institutes of well-being and national statistics of well-being that scientists tend to sort of rush in and tell us what a good life might be. It's more a reflection of our own lack of confidence rather than a reflection of science's ability to know what is right and what is wrong.
Okay, thank you. So, has anybody got any points or comments? It's not a Q&A. Please tell us what you think, as well as ask questions.
I just wanted to say that we kind of talk about a good life as if it's something to attain, and once we're there forever, but that's unrealistic. I mean, life goes through, you have good times and bad times. And I think part of having a good life is being realistic about also expecting some not so good times.
What I really like about the kind of these developments in scientific knowledge about well-being is that this concept of well-being can be chosen in such a way to kind of encompass different worldviews on well-being. So this should not be a static concept, not something that science defines, but something that's dynamic and that is informed by kind of public's opinion. So then, for example, the approach that was proposed here, one based mostly on freedom, liberty in a sense, is just one worldview, of course. It's a pretty Western, individualistic worldview in a sense, and one of the many. And I think that instead of claiming morality in a sense, science can kind of combine and bring together different views on morality as to in this concept of well-being, which everyone can decide for themselves. So I think that's a kind of an important nuance to make, that it's not so much that science should define morality, but that actually it should be informed by morality and define its concept of well-being on this, and then apply the scientific method to this, which I think is a very valuable addition in recent development.
I wanted to ask Nessa and Nancy about this question of freedom and whether you think that the science of epigenetics or a kind of scientific observation of well-being, whether you think that does pose any problems or questions around freedom. And it just reminded me of a situation the other week. I'm a teacher, and we had a teaching and learning meeting about well-being. And one teacher kind of got up and said, I'm just feeling wonderful at the moment. My well-being is absolutely up there because I'm eating superfoods at the moment and I'm only drinking hot water. And there was this kind of atmosphere of this is the right way to look after yourselves. This is the right way to achieve well-being. And there was something quite coercive, a kind of coercive atmosphere in that meeting. So I wonder whether you think that these findings do present any problems for freedom at all.
Yes, I'm Richard. I'd like to take up the point of freedom too. If one considers well-being or happiness as your important value, I'd just like to ask the question, isn't the idea of freedom being conducive to that a myth? I don't know whether you've come across Barry Schwartz's book, The Tyranny of Choice. And I think it's a very important point. I mean, choice in many ways can be very agonizing. And some of the most fulfilled people are those who, in a way, have such directing values, they may be believers of some kind or other, that they're not troubled too much by choice because they have a clear dynamic of what they want to do and where they're going. So I just want to raise that question. I'm not sure what the answer is, but is freedom necessarily beneficial for well-being?
Okay, good question. I'll take one more down, just a bit further down here, and then I'll bring the panel in, who can pick and choose whatever you want. You'll have to respond to every single point that's been made. Yes.
Hi there. I just wanted to ask Nancy about, within the context of well-being, what you think the impact of current society is on well-being. So you said that one of the definitions you provided was about paying attention to the world and observing it. How much do you think that people's dependence on smartphones, you look down a train carriage nowadays and no one's paying attention to what's happening around them, even walking down the street, people are on their phones. And also, what do you think the influence of the media and the way that we are very able to compare ourselves to other people and measure what we've achieved against others, what we have against what others have? How do you think that increased ability to compare yourself has an impact on well-being as well?
These are fantastic questions. Right. So being realistic about having not so good a time, absolutely. One of the interesting findings from the positive psychology research is that, yes, being happy is great, but you do need the grit. You need the grit in the oyster. And actually, how you view those bad times is quite important. So there's some quite good stuff from the CBT research around there. So I completely agree with you. And so there's a good book called After the Ecstasy, the Laundry. And actually, you've got to get on with the daily life and find that reality. So thank you for that. I love that well-being encompasses different views, and that one of the things I like about the well-being, the measurement of well-being by the national statistics, is it is bringing in that personal experience to what otherwise has been quite an objective debate, and it's valuing personal experience and our own definitions of it in public policy and the way our public discourse happens. So for me, this is really exciting. I like the shift from science says we should do this to scientific approach helps us understand it better and gives us some information in which to judge stuff. So I welcome that shift, which brings us back to this is the right way to achieve well-being, so superfoods, water or fasting, whatever it is you're doing. I agree. There has been a kind of sort of dominance from the health and fitness industries and sort of the spa industries about this is well-being. And actually one of the conversations we can have now is this is more than those things. It's not just about, if you Google well-being, you get an apple, you get someone doing some yoga, you might get the Dalai Lama, you might get a few other bits and pieces. In fact, you do. We've done this. But actually, it's broader than that. It is about how we value stuff. And someone was mentioning about the tyranny of choice. And people with religious faith do tend to be happier, but not all religions. It's probably worth looking at. Christianity and Judaism come out much more strongly, and there's probably a number of reasons. We don't quite know why that is. But this choice thing, people often say that there was no choice. That's why I did this. I was compelled. This was the right thing to do. And having a sense of purpose is really, really important. If you look at Viktor Frankl's work, this is really sustaining for our well-being. The impact of current society on well-being. This is a really good question. I'm cautious about demonising technology because I think technology brings us huge benefits. It enables us to connect in a way we didn't before. It enables my children to speak to their grandparents in Seattle through FaceTime and keeps that connection going when otherwise it would have been really challenging to do so. My daughters can't write yet. This is the way they keep in contact. But there is something we should be aware of when using technology and making sure we don't disconnect from our bodies. I was speaking to someone from Facebook or Google recently. They did a study that said that people valued their technology, their smartphone, more than their sense of taste. That's quite terrifying, because actually that's your connection to the real world, is your sense of taste. So there is something to be cautious of. But there is something about comparisons as well. You mentioned you see these quotes that I could live with being poor if I didn't see such riches. I think I've misquoted James there. But there's something about being all in it together. And looking at the inequalities of well-being is something I'd really like to see us do a bit more. Because who is most miserable in society? How can we help that change? The media, I think, doesn't always help us. So feeling safe is fundamental to feeling happy and safe, and feeling safe and our well-being. And media often undermines that quite massively, that sense of feeling safe.
So, Nessa.
So I think things like the superfood thing are interesting and often come into the category that I scientifically describe as utter bollocks. Because what we know is that very many of those kind of so-called health interventions have no basis in evidence whatsoever. What they probably reflect is that somebody is feeling better because they are taking control of their actions. And yes, it will absolutely be better to eat fruit and vegetables than to eat takeaways every night. It's not about superfoods, it's about a much simpler message than that. I also am a big fan of technology. I enjoy it. I'm determined never to get to that thing of thinking, oh, I'm too old, this is young people's stuff. I don't think it's the technology that's the problem, and I don't think it's the technology that's the problem particularly for children. I think the problem is that technology is being used to replace other experiences that it cannot replace. A few years ago, I went to my parents' house in southeast London, and my parents' house is 7 doors away from a park. And when I was a child, we just were sent out, and the park was heaving. I went there about 5 years ago, middle of August, no children in that park at all. Those children are at home probably looking at iPads because their parents think it's safer for them. And I think where we're making a really big mistake is in blaming technology when actually it's not technology per se that is the problem, it's the fact that technology has replaced what is probably a much more empowering and important experience, particularly for children, which is all to do with independence and a connection with the natural world and being able to understand risk and to take risks for themselves and to mature. So I think we blame the symptom when actually we need to be looking behind it at the cause, but symptoms are always easier to investigate, so scientifically we tend to fall into that sort of trap.
Okay. Angus.
Just it's on the superfoods question. I mean, I think we're sort of ended on the idea that there's been a weakening of the authority of traditional morality, ideas of what is right and what is wrong, has also had the effect of a sort of expansion of the moral domain. So we do have seemingly moral discussions about what to eat and what is healthy. And I don't think that's a moral question at all. It just has no bearing on it. There's a confusion in the language, maybe, that allows you to sort of slide from what is morally good to say what's good for my tummy, right? And then into how do I feel about it, and then into the sort of, to use Nessa's term, hippy dippy crap that Nancy's sort of evoking, which is how do I feel? Which is how do I feel about myself today after having eaten my healthy berries and my steamed water? I mean, do those things by all means, but just don't think that they're moral questions. The moral domain is actually quite restricted. It's nothing to do with what you eat. I don't think it's really got very much to do with who you sleep with or the sort of sexual practices you choose to engage in. I don't think those are really moral questions either. And there's been a big expansion of the moral domain, and a lot of people are very eager to get in there, sort of moral entrepreneurs who then start telling you how to live your own life. And I think you just need to be clearer about where those boundaries are. And the really moral questions of what is a good life, that has to come from use of one's reason alone. That can be the only underpinning. You ask yourself and you use your reason to work out what is good and what is not. It starts with a duty to oneself, but is always bound up from the beginning into a series of dutiful and loving relationships that one is born into. Parents and duties to them are something that inform our sense of morality from the beginning. And I think it's a relatively sort of narrow area of what a good life is.
So how does that concept of the good life and the well-being being about looking to oneself and working out these things, how does that correlate with the studies that suggest that the people who feel most secure and most comfortable often are people with a religious faith which takes away from them that necessity to look to themselves to define the moral environment?
I have no idea on what the studies might tell us about this. I suppose what I'm getting at is, I think it was a really good question about the tyranny of choice. Right? So I just immediately thought, again, and I know it's dodgy territory to talk about the example of Jesus in these, because you're all going to think I'm mad, right? But maybe I do it on purpose to just show up that spiritual side of the debate rather than the physical side of it. So the tyranny of choice, the agony in the garden the night before, wherefore my Lord hast thou forsaken me, that terrible choice of existential freedom that Jesus suffers, the night before. And what is he going to do? Is he alone? Has he been abandoned? Is there nothing but him? And I suppose in the end there is nothing but him. And he makes that choice himself. And he's gone through the agony of self-questioning and examination and arguing. It's what he does in his life, is go around and argue with people about things, trying to work out what the morally right thing is to do. I mean, what we're doing on the panel here, taking these questions very seriously and trying to work out as human beings what we think is right or not having reference to the studies, whether or not complacent religious people who go to Sunday school, turn up, tick the boxes, feel good about themselves. That's their problem. I think I'd be with Kierkegaard on this. Is the sort of the Sunday Christian who doesn't go through the relentless self-examination is the complacent, smug, bourgeois Christian who's not necessarily living a good life. If we're going to follow this Christian example, it would be the militant one who's racked also by self-doubt.
I want to respond to this idea that food is not a moral issue and that you can determine beforehand that it's not a moral issue. I think you cannot, because if you eat fish because it's so healthy for you, it has consequences for where the fish is caught, who's doing the catching, if we're fishing, empty the oceans and so on. Production of superfoods, quinoa, I think the stuff is called, it's produced by Peruvian farmers and they don't have any quinoa left because we eat all of that. So I think one of the things we are doing in this session now is trying to define in a general way what might be a good life. But I think that might be the wrong approach. Maybe we should look at all the different ways in which something gets a moral problem or a problem of the good life somewhere. So we are in such a complicated world now, everything is connected to everything. So where do these questions pop up? Where does it become a problem that people use technology? Where is it actually enhancing things? So my idea would be to make moral philosophy more of an empirical science, so to study how people think about these things and what they value and what they find important and where they start arguing with one another and in what kind of terms and how we could help these debates progress.
I'm David Wood, Chair of London Futurists. I want to come back to the question mainly addressed by Angus, which is if we don't use scientific and evidence-based methods and empirical methods to decide what is a good life, then what can we say to people whose opinions of the good life differ strongly from ours? When you give the example of cultures that threw babies off cliffs and you just said, well, it's obvious that this isn't a good thing to do. Let's take a more real example. There is a culture which is throwing homosexuals off the tops of roofs. Mm-hmm. And why they're doing that, and they will appeal to their own tradition. It may be a minority tradition inside Islam, but it is a tradition they can look to, which says we have to be intolerant of things which could damage the purity of our system. So what do you say to these people if you cannot point to empirical or evidence-based systems in which you can see that some behaviours tend to lead to human cultures flourishing more than others?
I'd like to say a word for hippy-dippy crap. For unscientific hippy-dippy crap. Because I think scientific hippy-dippy crap is the worst of all possible worlds. But, it seems there's a prevailing view nowadays which is, goes with what you said, Nessa, about thinking that everything has a biological basis. Which seems to think everything can be put into one of three categories. It's either biological or environmental or stochastic, the random crap. And epigenetics is a sort of shuttle bus between the biological and the environmental. And all of human social dynamics can be parked in the environmental. That's one view. What that view seems to lack, which people who don't break things into those three categories might believe in, is a notion of transcendence. Emergence exists in that worldview, which is complex outcomes arising from simple initial rules, but transcendence does not. There doesn't seem to be much room for transcendence. And that relief that you referred to, Nessa, that, epigenetics allows us to not, to get away from genetic determinism without resorting to hippy-dippy crap, seems to me to be a relief that we can dispense with transcendence. Transcendence is seen as a sacred concept now. There's not much room for a secular notion of transcendence. I find that interesting, and I must admit it worries me. I think there might be room for transcendence and science in a coherent worldview.
I'm aware this may be unique to me, and I may sound odd, but I like to watch the television programmes where they find very old skeletons from ancient Egypt or medieval times, and they dig them up and they look at them and they say, oh look, we can tell that this person had terrible malnutrition, or that they ate mainly barley, or that they lived most of their life with crippling arthritis or agonising toothache, or that they suffered a horrible injury from an axe but then recovered and lived for years, but it must have been terribly painful and they clearly lost the use of this arm. And I like them for two reasons. I'm not particularly morbid, but one of them is that I can look back and go, aren't we lucky to be living today and not in nearly all of the past, when a lot of these things have been conquered by modern science or medicine or simply agriculture or not being really, really poor and all that kind of thing. So great, I feel really lucky to be alive now, and my life is, by that measure, a better life in terms of how I experience it and the potential that it gives me, the time and the not having to scratch a living and so forth. But the other reason I like it is that I think, yes, but that actually tells me very little about that person. to know what chronic diseases they lived with and what they suffered through and what physical pains they underwent, and how their middle-age crisis may well have been brought on by suddenly realising their body was going to fail them and everything was going to be really hard work from here on in, which, incidentally, I don't think great apes get. I think, yeah, but actually this could be Samuel Pepys. This could be the person who first thought of Pythagoras' theorem. This could be the person who transformed human life in some way, or just wrote an amazing piece of music. Or they could just have been a person who had unique thoughts and ideas and loved people and had relationships that were completely unique to them, and with their death an entire universe vanished into a pinprick of life. And looking at their skeleton tells me nothing about that. And that helps me put into perspective when my life seems to be full of really niggly physical things that attack my kind of day-to-day mood kind of well-being, then it helps me step back and go, look, when you're dead, somebody may dig your skeleton up and look at these things, but that's not really me. My life is about what I think and experience and say and do and how I act in the world. And I think that without trying to devalue the way that science and medicine can improve human life and remove a lot of the obstacles to what we might do, it's really important to remember that by no means sums up the value of a human life.
It seems sort of a funny debate about, on one side, science can determine a good life, and on the other side, morality can, as if these things just existed out there, you know. But we all know the ancient Greeks and the Spartans threw babies off the cliffs and stuff like that. Morality isn't just out there. And I don't think science is just out there either. I quite like Jeanette's point that when we're talking about food, it's not easy to tell whether it's a moral question or a scientific question. And so maybe the thing about the good life is that there's real problems in any of these approaches taken on their own, as seen as pre-existing. And as Angus sort of mentioned, without a community that's shared and engaged in the world, it's very difficult to think of having morality or science in meaningful ways that could construct a good life. But I don't think it's really necessary to pose these things as hostile to each other in the way that we tend to be doing.
Okay, so I'm going to bring the panel in for very brief points, and then we'll take some last questions, and then I'll let them sum up. So, because I made her wait so long last time, Jeanette, would you like to come in on any point at the moment?
I'm agreeing with the last speaker that there's some interesting crossovers that we're not yet looking at so very well. So the way in which the sciences do influence what we think of as good, and how they put forward some kinds of good and not others, that we should relate to that, and that should be a serious object of study as far as I'm concerned. And also maybe to bring in that issue of many cultures and global connections, that there's so many different definitions of the good life that we should start taking these seriously and see how we can deal with all these different kinds of goods and where there's frictions between them.
So I think I want to start with the fact doesn't sum up everything in our life. I love this. I think there's also something about the memento mori, about the archaeological finds as well. It reminds us of the importance of death, and that we will all die. It doesn't sum up our life, and actually this is our well-being and our good life is a real complex issue, and we do need to rely on collective wisdom, which I think is probably what morality is, our collective wisdom. But the important bit here is to test it out. So actually it's important to test out why somebody thinks that the superfoods are the important. This is what's made their life better. Actually, what may be happening there is that they've taken charge of their life, and actually it's worth understanding that a little bit better. And it's rather that we gather dust on our morality, potentially. The transcendence and secular, wow. Yes, there has to be space for transcendence. One of the things I think science is trying to do is sort of secularise this vacuum where religion once was. And there are some really interesting studies on how transcendence affects us and what can do. So I think we just don't know how to study it yet, potentially. But it doesn't sum up everything we do, and I don't think it ever can. I think there is something interesting about this hippy-dippy crap idea and the morality idea, and being proud of not knowing the studies because I'm going to rely on my self-reflection, and therefore everything else is hippy-dippy crap. But then it's kind of circular back round again, that if I rely, it feels a bit disingenuous. One of the things the studies have shown us is the importance of self-reflection and the internal change that's important for a good life. and this collective discussion about, okay, what does happy mean? It's not just about buying new things and getting pleasure. We're getting quite a sophisticated debate. So I'm really excited to see that we're starting to recognise that it's not a science or morality debate. It's much more complex than that.
Yeah, I think I'd just add to build on that slightly, and partly from Sandy's point as well. I believe that everything in biological life, which is what we are, has a biological basis, that somewhere there is a physical basis to it, because otherwise I have to get into concepts that I'm deeply uncomfortable with, such as the soul, which for me don't work at all. So I'm a scientist. I believe everything has a biological basis. I don't, however, believe that that means everything can be biologically understood only in the terms of biology, partly because some questions may simply be extraordinarily difficult, such as consciousness, and also because actually all you have to do is look at mathematical theories, such as by Poincaré, that demonstrate there is a limit to predictability. Once you have get beyond a certain number of variables, you simply cannot predict what a system is going to do. So think about the variables in human life and consciousness. We won't be able to predict everything. Biology will not be a good way into that. But I don't think I would ever want to see biology excluded from the argument either. When I tend to talk about things like utter bollocks, what I basically mean is that biology and scientific method is being ignored, and yet people are pretending it's been used. That's my bugbear with it, and that's my bugbear with the sort of hippy-dippy crap dismissive phrase that I use. It's not that I don't believe in a concept of well-being, it's I hate it when people say, and we've shown this scientifically, and they have no clue what scientific method is, or they've completely abused the system. So that's what I really dislike. So I think we need to use science to address certain questions, but also to accept it can't address everything because of this scale of questioning. But I don't think we should ever use that as a system to say we need to keep science and morality separate, or science and wider society separate. My big issue with a lot of scientific training is not that we spend too much time discussing ethics and morality, it's that as scientists we don't train people well enough to address those topics. We keep scientists in silos. The number of young scientists who have never studied anything on ethics or the philosophy of science or the history of science is terrifying. And to me, we need to bring science more into that fold, not keep it further away.
I could duck this one, but I think it behooves one to be brave. So I believe in the soul. I don't think fish have them, which is why I'm not concerned about the moral impact of eating too many fish and what that might mean for fish stocks and fish happiness worldwide. And underwater positivity, because if fish start to exhibit self-consciousness, I'll have moral qualms about eating them, in the same way that I have moral qualms about killing other human beings, and I object to people throwing people off buildings, whether they're homosexual or not. I don't think it's probably irrelevant whether or not they're homosexual. What we've got here is a case of people being murdered. And I object to that just on straightforward Kantian lines. It's not what I would like to have done to me. And I think that's very clear moral absolute. It's not a question of cultural relativism at all. And I think we're in danger of being too fearful about our own ability to make moral judgments. Killing people is wrong. Lying to people is wrong. And it's interesting that Kant thought that is the one really serious moral flaw, is lying to other people. And people always get really difficultly confused about this idea. Come on, you need to lie to, wield the social progress. If we were all honest with each other all the time, society would fall apart. Well, maybe, but I think he means more that the real moral sin is lying to oneself, right? And not being honest with oneself, because as soon as you lie to yourself and you try and convince yourself that something is good, but secretly it's not, and you've been a coward, when you lie to yourself, you need to live with a liar for the rest of your life, right? And you get into that awful situation. It's hell is other people, but that other person, that liar, is yourself, and you're stuck with him. And the only way out of it for Kant was the mercy of bad memory. But we do that all the time, don't we? I mean, that is the moral dilemmas we live with all the time. We knowingly do wrong things and then try and find a way of shuffling off our responsibility for it. And when you do really bad things, like push people off buildings, hopefully, you find yourself intolerable. through the rest of one's life and go to one's grave with that awful person on your shoulder. So I think that there are moral absolutes that are sort of limited in character, and my objection to finding the answer in the studies is that it becomes a real, evasion of moral responsibility. You look in the studies for the answer to the moral question. Socrates is the best on this. He says, I can't live with myself if I just go along with what society dictates. Right? He's very, a precursor to Kant on this. He says, the one thing I couldn't live with was singing along because everybody else tells me it's good to sing along, if I know that I need to object to something because it's wrong. And if society says we must live in a certain way, and I, Socrates, know it's wrong, I'm not Socrates, but you know what I mean, I know it's wrong, then it's my duty to stand up and say so, even if it leads to, state execution. But the one thing he couldn't live with was being dishonest to himself. And I think that is at the heart of morality for everybody. There are no cultural differences there. That's a unique thing that we are born into because of self-consciousness. You start with that questioning, what do I think about things? Am I right on it or not?
We've got time for another 3 or 4 very quick points from you before I bring the panel back in to sum up.
You said there are things happening randomly and we can't explain them. But is it possible to prove or disapprove randomness? And from a more reductionist point of view, can we have a theory of everything?
Hi. I wanted to address Angus, where you just spoke about, you've been speaking about morals the whole time, but obviously there are more than just don't lie and don't kill people. I think what Jeannette my understanding of Jeanette's comment about fish is that it's not as simple as just, does a fish have a soul? Is it something that's related directly to how the fish feels? There are even human implications. Are we going to wear out the seas? Things like that. And with the amount of information that's currently available to us, is it difficult to reconcile happiness and trying to act purely morally? Because we have such an understanding now that, for example, we might try to eat healthily, we might eat quinoa, as the example you provided, but on a moral basis, are we then depriving people who've used that as a staple food for a long time from having that food available to them? Is that a selfish thing that we're doing? And in that respect, you can't buy clothes truly ethically unless you make them yourselves, is something that I think a lot of people deal with themselves, trying to work out how can I have the best impact on the world. And with the amount of information we now have, is it difficult to be purely moral, or are there just too many things where there's implications that, you take the train, that's going to have some kind of impact on the environment, Is it too complicated, and is that kind of a burden on well-being?
I think we've started to confuse the debate somewhat, because I don't think, Angus, that most empirical scientists are actually trying to make a claim on absolute morality. I think we're talking about two different things when we talk about well-being and we talk about morality. I don't think the Office of National Statistics is trying to tell you how to live a good moral life. I think they're trying to find out what makes us happy. I don't think epigeneticists are trying, you forgive me if I'm wrong, I don't think they're trying to tell you what's right and what's wrong in the world. And I'm also fearful of anyone that talks in absolutes about those kinds of things. I believe that murder is wrong, but there are plenty of cases throughout history where different societies have thought very differently about these kinds of things, and absolutes have evolved and changed over different societies. So I wanted to make that point. But I do also have a question about the statistics that we're making. I've had that since it's been niggling my head for a while now. You asked the question, how happy were we yesterday, and how anxious were we yesterday? Now, I've been thinking about my head. On a scale of 1 to 10, I can't even work it out. Just trying to think about that. It's even how accurate do you think those statistics are? Because at some points yesterday I was a 2, and at some points I was a 10. It really just depended on what side of the bed I woke up on. I'm worried as well of these statistics trying to find out of happiness and subjective well-being, which does morph and change things over time. And I wanted to know what studies showed that how accurate they really were. We've all seen the thing that Denmark is the most happy country in the world, and we don't quite know why. I've been to Copenhagen, I don't really understand it.
Right, I'm going to have to bring the panel back in. Jeannette, would you like to start?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, but maybe responding also to the last question, I think we're thinking about scientific research very much in terms of what has an effect on our well-being or on our happiness. And that's also a bit scary. So why do we want to know? Do we want to have a happy society where everyone is happy? The first question that was asked was, how to include unhappiness and failure and these kind of things. And I think as a last thought, I want to remind you of that novel of the Brave New World, where everybody was happy because everybody was drugged. And this wasn't, this was the thing of my youth that we discussed. Is this the kind of world that we want to live in, or is there other things that are important?
Thank you, Jeannette and Nancy.
So that's one of my favourite books, actually. I really recommend it. If you haven't read Brave New World, please do. My goodness. There is a tyranny of choice on our moral options, actually, and it can be overwhelming for lots of people, particularly this sort of overwhelming, pervading sense of anxiety about, can I do anything? Have I got a right to exist? And it probably comes down to your right to exist, actually. I don't know if I can say a great deal more about that. The statistics one is really interesting. How accurate? Actually, they're surprisingly accurate. Your friends are able to predict pretty roughly, people who know you are able to predict pretty roughly what you'll say, surprisingly. They're not perfect, though, and I don't think they ever claim to be perfect or the only measure you should use. But they're a start, and I think they're better than not measuring anything at all. One of the things about change over time is really important. So one of the things that the experts in this area are talking about at the moment is it's actually happiness is more of a sum of pleasure and purpose over time. So this is not just your good things that happen, it's also the sense of meaning and purpose, and actually how that happens over time, which I think is quite a good concept. It's really challenging, but it's why it's worth looking at things, whether they have a long-term or short-term impact. So one thing I want to say is that if you ask people who have cosmetic surgery, how happy they are before and after. In theory, you shouldn't pay for cosmetic surgery because it's cosmetic. It's not a life-threatening thing. But actually, it's one of the few things that actually has a sustained positive impact on well-being, bizarrely. Like unemployment has a sustained negative impact, and it actually sustains over time, which has an impact on health and a whole range of other things that you want to care about. So I think that over time thing is worth exploring. And my last point probably I want to end on is that a scientific approach includes the freedom of thought and the importance of doubt, and we're free to judge the conclusions drawn from what evidence is found, and that is probably the fundamental bit. This is just something that somebody has found. They've looked at it, this is how they've looked at it, this is what they found. We are still free to judge that.
Yeah, I have nothing much I can add in terms of epigenetics to this one, so I'm a bit of a fraud being here. I think it is incredibly important to find ways of collecting robust data that actually inform us rather than just tell us what we already want to believe. I think it's incredibly important because that should be driving government policy. And one of my greatest concerns is that with the system that we have of short-term government, we have enormous difficulties in investing for the long term, and actually it's long-term structures that we need to drive the greatest well-being, because I think of the data that I'm aware of, the data suggests that actually one of the things that is most counter to a healthy society, both in terms of physical health and mental and emotional health, is high degrees of inequality. And we have increasing degrees of inequality through the whole of the Western world. And I think that is probably the biggest demographic problem we will face. It's not about ageing, it's about ageing while poor. It's about ageing in a society in which we have an increasing depth of despair that has gone backwards from when I was a child and dependent on state education and state housing. So I have nothing epigenetic. I just think governments need to use the data intelligently.
I take the point from the floor about not all scientists are in the business of telling us how to live and what to think, and nor should they. But I do think there is a sort of overstepping of the mark often into moral territory. So the mention of smoking, banning of smoking in cars in front of the children, sort of thing, does put scientists on that front line of the moral question, where they can say that they're not involved, but a degree of it is sort of disingenuous. There are people who are willing to overstep the mark, and in the absence of a secure sense within ourselves of what is morally right or wrong, the door is open, I think, for people to come in and make moral claims based on the basis of the studies or what how you felt yesterday, because there is that sort of moral vacuum that people can play in and can substitute science for ethics, which is the danger I'm sort of pointing out. So I'm bending the stick against it. I take your point, and I'm sort of bending the stick on the fish question, because I don't think that, and I said at the beginning, that sort of self-determining freedom doesn't mean license. It doesn't mean that I think it's morally good to go and eat all the fish in the ocean and wear out the seas, whatever that means. Gluttony is a sin, remember, right? Now, so there is, I've been bending the stick, but there is, something moral about self-limiting. Don't eat more than you need to. Don't burn down forests because you can, right? Take what you need for yourself and to enable you to be in the world, but not at the expense of other people. Because, again, it's a Kantian morality, isn't it? Do as you would be done by. These things are quite straightforward. I think it comes down to this point. I'll just finish on this. It's the weakened sense of subjectivity. It's the fearfulness of whether or not we're right or wrong about things that leads to the feeling that I've heard in a few of the questions about, isn't it terribly complicated? What happens if I eat the fish, or what happens if I wear the jeans, or what happens if I don't have the vapor rub, or whatever? What impact will it have, and is it all interconnected? And oh goodness, what do I do? And it's sort of paralyzing, fearful decision, because we're in the end afraid of our own ability to make moral judgments. It's sort of a weakened sense of self that has resulted from a weakening of traditional authority, moral authority, that leaves us sort of feeling alone. And then you naturally, and I don't blame people for this, you look for supports, and you look for solid supports. And what could be more solid than the science tells us that it's right? It's a very human thing to do when you feel this dizzying moral void in front of you. You look for solid supports in the science, in the objective. But it's a false friend, because it cannot give any meaning to human life. That can only be in our self-conscious and free experience of the world. It's a natural world, but we're sort of unnatural beings in it, because we do have those moments of being able to self-determine.